Welcome back to the Jeremiah Show. So, we're talking about the record plant today. The record plant was a groundbreaking recording studio that revolutionized the recording experience and became a legendary name in music history. In 1976 alone, the studio produced three #1 albums: Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life, the Eagles' Hotel California, and Fleetwood Mac's Rumors. Without the record plant, chances are your record collection would sound very different. Buzz Me In gets into all the drama and legendary music that came out of the New York and California studios in the 70s, with cameos from Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Wonder, Fleetwood Mac, and more. That's Rolling Stone's review of Buzz Me In inside the record plant studios. Founded in New York City in 1968 by Gary Kellgren and Chris Stone, the record plant revolutionized the music industry by offering a unique and comfortable studio environment. Unlike the typical clinical, white-walled studios of that era, the record plant created a living room style that fostered a relaxed and a collaborative atmosphere for the artists. Over the years, the record plant studios were the birthplace of numerous iconic albums, including Jimi Hendrix, Electric Ladyland, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, as I've mentioned before, the Eagles' Hotel California, Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run, Metallica's Load and Reload, and Kanye West's The College Dropout. In the Los Angeles studio, Beyonce even recorded parts of her album Lemonade. With over 30 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees and more than 100 gold, platinum, and multi-platinum albums credited to its name, the Record Plant Studios have left an indelible mark on music history. And as Carlos Santana happily put it on a visit to the Sausalito studio, this place is more important than the Vatican. Based on Chris Stone's memoirs, archives, and interviews with over 100 studio employees, music producers, and recording artists, the new book by Martin Porter and David Goggin, Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studio, offers a thrilling ride through a decade of high drama, hedonism, high-tech sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the musical genius behind it. My special guests today are the authors of Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios, Martin Porter and David Goggin. Martin Porter, he's an author and a journalist who began his career as a technology writer and reporter in the mid-70s for Rolling Stone, GQ, and Premiere magazines. And in 78, he was the first editor of Pro Sound News, a trade magazine for the professional audio industry. He served as editor and publisher for several recording and musical instrument publications, including EQ, Guitar Player, and Surround Pro magazines. Martin Porter is considered one of the leading chroniclers of the golden period in music and audio technology. And David Goggin, a renowned author, photographer, and musical journalist, has had a passion for the recording industry since 1967, which was fueled by his initial experience in a recording studio while the Beatles recorded I Am the Walrus. His work has been featured in various publications, including Rolling Stone, the New York Times, the LA Times, Billboard, and the Hollywood Reporter. Notable interviews include conversations with Brian Wilson, Robbie Robertson, Leonard Cohen, and Phil Ramone. He's authored several books, including Studio Life, Hal Blaine and the Wrecking Crew, Faces of Music, and Music Smarts. His work highlights the stories and insights of leading musicians, producers, and engineers. And in 2009, he established Bonfire Films, creating interview videos for clients like Berklee College of Music and independent projects with artists such as Spinal Tap and Weird Al Yankovic. Martin and David also manage the popular Record Plant Diaries Facebook page. You can find that on Record Plant Diaries on Facebook and the website recordplantdiaries.com. Welcome, Martin and David.
Hi,
Hi
Jim.
there.
Hi.
How are
Great
you,
to be here,
gents?
man.
Good to have you here. Good to have you here. What a fascinating book, and what an important book in the library in the history of music. I just love it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we get started here, I wanted to just let's consider together recording studios. Why are they more than just four walls and recording equipment? How do they become so important, not only to the artist, but the sound of the album that is created within those four walls? Kind of do me a favor and romanticize a recording studio for me. Bring it to life.
You have to think about the artist. It all starts with the art, right?
Hmm.
And you posit the theme, does the space where the artist creates influence the final product? Can you create an environment? Can you create a vibe? Can you create an aura that turns the artist on and lets him and her achieve their greatest art? And that was Gary Kellgren, the founder's dream. He felt that space really was part of it. And that until the late 60s, recording studios were labs. They were cold, they were union, they were label owned, and they were not exactly the most artist friendly environments. But with rock and roll came a change. And Gary Kellgren saw that change, and he saw that the recording studio needed to be a comfortable, private, and safe space for the artist. And in that environment, the artist would flourish. And he proved to be right. And that formula that he started in '69 lasted at Record Plans until last year in LA, creating a living room environment,
Right.
not a lab, was his goal. And he achieved it.
And how did the record plant is so known for this is in what you just described, creating that environment for the artist that they can create their greatest work. How do you do that with being that artists are all individuals and have their own ways of doing things? How do they duplicate that or change that for each artist as they came through? Or does the artist bring that to the studio a lot?
I think
Does that make sense?
yeah,
Sure.
the studio, you might think of the studio as a blank canvas
Hmm.
that has all of the paints that you could, and you can imagine that those paints being the audio technology. And Record Plant was always ahead of the pack as far as the latest tape machines. This is all analog, remember? And
Hmm.
there was, Sergeant Pepper was four tracks. By 1967 and 68, eight tracks was prevalent. And they hungered for this ability to have more control and a bigger canvas, shall we say. Also, the playback was very important. These artists wanted to hear the work as loud as their favorite fans would be playing it. And that was due to the technology that um, record plants engineers invented, things like the famous Hidley monitors that could withstand the loud levels that Joe Walsh was pumping out for a song called The Bomber. Every day the monitors were blowing up and falling off the wall. And Tom Hidley, another important person in the story, developed the monitors that could withstand. That was the request. Can you make a monitor that Joe can't blow up? And it became a standard that is still a standard around the world today. So it was the technology, it was the comfort zone, the only studio that you could lock the doors on the inside. You were safe once you got inside there, and you could do whatever you wanted. You could explore all your creativity. You could totally relax. You could bring your friends in. You could even stay overnight in the bedrooms that were designed for the artists. The famous sissy room, if you wanted a kind of a fluffy bed and a place to relax and cogitate. The boat room, that was kind of more of a hidden place with portholes. And then, the rack room, if you wanted to get a little kinky, maybe. which certainly was prevalent. But this all contributed to the environment where the artist could do whatever he wanted, and he could create the sounds that he had in his mind due to the technology and the incredible engineering that went into all of the studios and the staff.
And there was a whole generation of kids, just like there were kids on the road trying to get close to the artist. There was a whole generation of early tech bros. Before there was computers, before there was AI, before there was social media. What was the original tech? It was audio in those days. Audio was high tech. That equipment were hundreds of thousands of dollars, and getting close to the tech was a young generation of kids who would do anything. They'd work for $1 an hour just to work to be able to be near the artist. Those young kids were instructed by Stone and Kellgren to serve the artist. Get them what they want, how they want, any way they want, and stay out of their way. That was their job. And with that background, some of these kids grew up to be very successful producers and very rich individuals. Jack Douglas was one of those kids. He started as a janitor,
Hmm.
served the artist, served John Lennon, and ended up doing Aerosmith, and eventually did John and Yoko. Jimmy Iovine was one of those kids. And Jimmy the Shoes Iovine, as he was known, was trained by the record plant how to serve the artist, and built an amazing career as a producer, and also obviously became a billionaire with Beats headphones. So the success stories there are manifold, but no question about it. In addition to the technology, there was a whole group of young people whose job was one thing: serve the artist.
How did you both get involved? What part did you come in the story?
Well, I think I should take it over now. And I knew Chris Stone quite well. When he was transitioning, not his body, but his studio from the original location in LA to a new location, he wanted to convince everybody that the tradition would continue. This was 1985. He asked me to kind of explain to the public, and so I helped him with that. I set up photos. I suggested a final concert on Third Street. We called it the Last Jam, around the same time as the Last Waltz. Joe Walsh came out, Al Cooper, everybody in town that had worked there. I mean, it was just a madhouse that night. A great send off. And then after that, Stone and he asked me to continue with helping out with the record plant and the image and everything until he eventually sold it to Chrysalis Records and had a nice party with George Martin. And then an entrepreneur, you got to remember, he found the money to build the first studio for Jimi Hendrix in New York. And he had a lot of adventures in mind after Record Plant. I invariably got roped into it and helped out on many of these ventures. And then Marty, who had been hanging around and knew me for years and had met Stone, we met once, and Marty, you can take it over now, because Marty really thought that this should be a book, but it wasn't easy coaxing Mr. Stone.
Yeah, because remember, this was a private place. A lot of stuff went down in these studios that nobody really wanted to get out there, and Stone respected that.
Right.
He kept it private. But later in his life, after being pushed and pried with martinis at endless backyard drink fests, me and Dave, we convinced him, you know what? This wasn't going to do any harm. In fact, it was going to open the door. It was going to buzz people in to a whole new world where they didn't exist and that they didn't know existed, and help a lot of people who maybe not have been recognized for the contribution of the music, and to really make sure that the public knew a couple of things. One, who Gary Kellgren was, because Gary died early and got in a very tragic death of drowning in his backyard pool. Um, and Gary was a genius, and Gary was a force in music. Music would not sound the way it was or is if it wasn't for Gary Kellgren. And by and large, people forgot who he was. The second thing that Stone said was there were hundreds of young people out there who busted their ass and worked around the clock and killed themselves for very little pay, who really deserve some credit as well. Get them recognized. And we got fortunate through interviewing them through Stone that we learned that they actually had the best stories anyway. So we got real lucky there. So Stone wanted that to happen, as David said, Stone was an amazing entrepreneur. David and I are his last project. This book from I guess from the tomb, he's put this deal together, and it's working out. I think he's up there smiling at us right now.
You both have, I love that story. You both have spent your life in music. You're writing about the artist, chronicling the history and the making. How does this book fit in? How do you view it as in terms of importance for the culmination of all of the stories that you've done on the music industry?
Well, personally for me, I worked 5 years in radio, again, music. I learned how to engineer and produce because I produced about 3,000 radio commercials. We're talking underground radio. And then from there, I happened to be around when a recording studio got started in the 70s, the same time as this was going on, a small studio down in Newport Beach. And, I learned how to record, I learned how to run a studio. And after 5 years, that was enough. And I sold a story and came to Hollywood to find fame and fortune and follow my dream. But the experiences in the studios, I mean, we were really there. Marty was too. I mean, he was writing about it. He was popping in. I was in the trenches with the artists. So we bring really insights that are not so common anymore. The way studios were is no longer. There's a few studios left, but it's a whole different world. And we were able to interview these people, many of whom who have passed along since we started 10 years ago. We've been working on this.
Wow.
I guess you're talking about a project of passion and love,
Hmm.
and also a tribute to the many of the friends that we know that deserve recognition. You have no idea how these guys contributed to the records that you still love today, and they'll be playing this stuff in spaceships in 100 years, long after we're all gone. And at least now people will be able to find out how it was done.
Hmm.
If you ask anybody, Jeremiah, name a recording studio. Number one is always going to be Abbey Road, right?
Right.
Recording studio is going to be bigger than where Beatles named it, right? Second will be Electric Lady Studios, right? Jimmy's own studio, which people failed to recognize was he worked in only 10 weeks before he died, and 2 years early, for the 2 years previously, worked at Record Plant. It all started with Jimi Hendrix. And people, you ask people about Record Plant, suddenly they start remembering all those little album credits on the back of their albums. Go into any vinyl store. Their Record Plant is everywhere. Anywhere there was a Zelig of rock and roll in the 70s and 80s, it was a place. It wasn't a person. It's a place called Record Plant.
So true. So true. Yeah. I'm, if you came up with a list of studios, I think I'd follow your list. How did you guys, did you spend a lot of time, you said in the studios, you've sort of grown up in the studios and with the artists there. Did did that affect this love letter at all? I mean, was it for
Oh
you, was
yeah.
it easier for you to tell the story and to find the perspective and find the storyline
Yeah,
based
we
off of your
weren't we
experience?
weren't just looking from above and imagining what it was like. We were really there. We were in the studios, the good, bad, and the ugly. I mean, it
Hmm.
gets incredibly uptight in a studio. If you've got an artist, he just had a number one hit, and he's got to follow it with another number one hit. The pressure on the artist, the pressure on the producer. And oh, you wouldn't believe it, the pressure on the engineers. It might go around the clock, and it did quite often with Record Plant to achieve that dream of the artist. So yeah, we were, we know what was going on. And it informed us so that we could ask people, and they trusted us. They knew that we knew a little bit about the tough times as well as the glory times.
So there were three studios. First was New York, and then in 69, Los Angeles, 72, Sausalito. Were there significant differences in each location and distinctive amenities, I guess, in each location? Did each have its own personality?
Yeah, no question about that. And it was an evolution. But it started in New York with Jimi Hendrix, like we said, on 44th Street. And that was, that was not, the first room was not the most technologically advanced room, although it was cooler, hipper, and more serve the artist better than other places. But Gary and Chris moved out to LA, they ran into a guy named Tom Hidley, and David mentioned him before, and he can't underestimate his influence because he created a sound of a generation. Not only the monitors that he was talking about, but the control room designs, the way the control room jutted into the studio. He came up with so many innovations that really changed the way a studio should function. And when LA was built, it was the first real Hidley room, Hidley Kellgren room. So they went back to New York and rebuilt Studio A to be up on LA level. And so LA was brought up to LA on par with LA, and it was that same Hidley design that was used in Sausalito as well. But Sausalito, which was the last Gary Kellgren studio, and which, by the way, is the only Gary Kellgren studio still operating out of Sausalito. It's called 2200 Bridgeway, and it's back up and running, and it's almost exactly what it was with a major technology rehab. But they were all Hidley rooms. But by the time that Kellgren was building Sausalito, something else had happened. Jimmy had built Electric Lady Studios, and everybody's eyes, he blew everybody out. And by the way, Kellgren was a genius. Hidley was a genius, but nobody did anything more artistically beautiful and than what Hendrix did with John Storick, his designer in New York. So Kellgren had it was a competitive sort. So he built Sausalito to outdo Jimmy, and you know what? He did outdo Jimmy with Sausalito. It's his masterpiece.
What was the legendary the pit? What was the
Oh
pit?
boy. Take it away, Marty. But that
Well,
was designed. It's funny. New York was designed for Jimi Hendrix. Sausalito needed a Hendrix. And so it turned out maybe that could be Sly Stone. He had worked in LA too. And they designed that studio, the Pit. It's kind of an eccentric concept because Sly wanted to sit at the bottom of the pit and look up at all the tiers of artists and musicians playing. Acoustically, it was a real complex thing, but it ended up being a legendary studio anyway. And Record Plant again was the inner sanctum where Sly could run when he was being chased by the narcs across the Golden Gate Bridge and was able to make it to the studio. The Pit really was responsible for one major hit, probably the biggest hit of Fleetwood Mac, because Stevie Nicks was, they were all going nuts after being involved for 9 months in such a strange, eccentric, out of out of control situation. She slipped into Sly's studio, the Pit, and then into his private bedroom, which had the mirrors and all that stuff. When it was quiet, sat on the bed, his huge bed, with a little tape recorder and a microphone, and wrote Dreams in half an hour.
Yeah, I think that under the covers, wasn't it built also where you could the artist could record under covers or under
now
a sheet.
there was a patch bay there where Sly could plug into the studio from the bed. He could. It also had an escape hatch so he could hide away from hide in case he was busted. He
Incredible.
could hide under the bed. So
That's
you
incredible.
know, but like David said, they were always looking for another Hendrix. What do you want? It was a business, right? They were selling
Mhm.
time, especially Stone. Stone was selling time, and he always figured to keep the artist there, right? Keep the artist working. And if you could find an artist who just booked a year at a time, owned a studio, that was money in the bank. In New York, it was Hendrix. In Sausalito, it was Sly. In L.A., most importantly, it was Stevie Wonder in Studio B, which was built by the same architect who built Electric Lady Studios for Hendrix, John Storick. Um, he built Studio B in LA, and that was where Stevie and his producers and his monster synthesizer Tonto produced almost the entire classic period of Stevie Wonder's output. You're talking about everything from Talking Book to Inner Visions to Songs in the Key of Life, Fulfilling This, Last Finale, all recorded in that one quadraphonic surround sound studio, Studio B in LA.
Going back to Fleetwood Mac and the Rumors album, released in 1977, the Dreams that you mentioned, the story about Stevie Nicks, she recorded that in 10 minutes at the studio.
She wrote it in 10 minutes.
Wrote it
It
in 10 minutes,
probably
excuse
took
me, not
6 months
recorded.
to.
Yeah, right. Wasn't that one of the production costs were so high for that album? Like at that time, 1 million, which was a lot of a lot of money for the
Oh,
production.
God.
Well, it was,
I-
you remember, 77, we're talking 76. And you mentioned in your introduction, and it was really amazing. Three record plan albums owned the Billboard, top of the Billboard chart for almost an entire year, starting with Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life, which was recorded elsewhere, but most of the songs were, at least initially, developed at record plant. Hotel California, Eagles, and Rumors, Fleetwood Mac, combined almost 100 million units sold by those three albums. And really an incredible accomplishment and really the peak of success for Record Plant.
when I first became aware of Record Plant, was through the Fleetwood Mac Rumors, the classic album series that they did, the documentary. That's Have you guys seen that,
Yes.
doc? Yeah, I mean, it's just an incredible story of them and the process they went through, the fights, the love, the breakups, the recording of that album. I definitely recommend somebody check that out if you're into that. I wanted to move on to the Eagles, and Hotel California was also recorded. What can you guys tell me about that album, and what significant stories stand out?
Well, it starts with Bill Szymczyk and Joe Walsh working together. And then the Eagles recording in England, and they wanted to rock and roll. And their producer really didn't want to take it that way. He thought they were a harmony band. So they come out to LA and they meet Stone, they meet Kellgren and Walsh, and they have a meeting and they decide to record it at Record Plant. Marty, take it away.
So Bill Zimzik is an important part of the story because Bill was an old buddy with Gary Kellgren. They started out as recording engineers in the early days, doing building stuff before they got into rock and roll. And Bill went off his own way and became a very successful producer with Joe Walsh. But when Eagles were ready to rock, it was his turn. And On the Border, One of These Nights, and Hotel California, California was his greatest achievement. And Record Plant, because it was Gary's studio, became their home. It wasn't their exclusive home. Studios moved, artists moved around but clearly Hotel California, the song, was influenced by the environment that Gary Kellgren created. There were so many similarities to the objects, the design, the vibe of Record Plant that many people believe that the song was written about Record Plant.
Mhm.
But and when Rolling Stone magazine asked Don Henley that, he said, "No, we wrote that song there, but no, it wasn't about the place. But wait a minute, what place had hotel rooms? What was in the background, in the back? What bed with beds with mirrors on the ceiling? What it had a jacuzzi. They had hotel towels that they gave out to the artists so they could, like any hotel. It was the place was built, like I said, by Stone with a business model. You can check out, but you never leave. You always came back to Record Plant.
And
And
who was the pretty lady that took him down the hallway?
well, that was Rose Mann, and she was the first. She started as the studio manager
Oh,
there.
that's
Very
great. So
methodically,
you had an
beautiful
answer for
woman.
that. I love
They
that.
even had a night man. It was a guy named Michael Gately who buzzed you in. He was the night man. So I know Kellgren and Stone always felt the song was written about Record Plant, but maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But there's no question, like I said earlier, the environment influenced the artist, and
Hmm.
there's no question that the environment of Record Plant influenced that song.
Songs in the Key of Life. Stevie Wonder. What an iconic album. What's your favorite story about Stevie recording songs in the Key of Life at the Record Plant Studios?
I
Both in
would,
LA and Sausalito, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah. I think we have to back up just a little bit to when his room, Studio D was was built to accommodate a huge synthesizer that had never been fully explored until Malcolm Cecil and uh, and Margalef got together with Steve, and he was able for the first time in his life to create sounds that were in his mind in a quad room, if you could believe, predating immersive sound and everything.
Mm.
So, Marty, take them forward to songs in the key of life.
So these guys worked together for 3 years, making 4 albums, and just endless. They could not make gold together. It was working out, and the room was an instrument in the market in the making of the music. And Stevie and Bob Margouleff and Malcolm Cecil were amazing, and together they recorded 300 songs during that period. Now, the way they made the albums, they picked the best songs and sequenced them, right? So by the time that one after the other, they would find the best songs, they would make sure they worked together, they sequence it, and they'd go on to make the next album. Songs in the Key of Life actually came at the end of that relationship. They used many of the songs that were written and produced by them, but they broke up by that time. Money got in the way, right? Typical rock and roll story that the producers felt they were owed something. Stevie's management didn't think they were and even were due anything, and it all exploded.
Mm.
Songs in the Key of Life was the first album that Stevie produced by himself after Malcolm and Bob left, but it was still a Record Plant recording. And the engineer, his new engineer, was a young assistant who grew into the chair, a gay guy named Gary Olazabal, who really became Stevie's engineer for what, David, over like 20 years later. Uh,
Well, he's still working with him. I mean, it's 50 years now, and they still are in touch. I just talked to him a couple days ago. Um, so that's a long-standing relationship.
Now, the Yamaha GX1 synthesizer was, he nicknamed it the Dream Machine, if I'm not mistaken,
Oh
which
God, the Dream
right, which
Machine.
created a wide range of sounds on this album, and then
Yeah.
also the multi-tracking was that pretty new at that time? Was that pretty out? Was that innovative?
Well, we were up to 24 tracks then, I think.
Uh-huh.
Right, Marty?
Yeah, it was 24 track by that time. The synthesizer technology, though, is an important part of the story because remember, the bulk of analog, we were talking about analog technology in the 70s, right? 2-inch tape, 4 track, 8 track, 12 track, 16 track, 24 track. We were in an escalation of tracks, multi-track recording, but digital hadn't quite come in yet. Right, but it was coming in on the instrument front, but people weren't recording digitally yet. Now you can record a set of Pro Tools on a laptop. Then it was the first digital equipment were outboard geared and synthesizers. And Stevie came in with a very I guess original early synthesizer named Tonto. He evolved into the ARP synthesizer, and then by Songs in the Key of Life, the technology had evolved tremendously, and the Yamaha synthesizer became his instrument of choice.
His Dream Machine.
Yep.
It's also notable that this album had really long recording sessions, right? Like some lasting up to 48 hours. And I don't think if we can move on to our next artist here that we want to talk about at the Record Plant Studios. I don't think there was another artist that took so long to these recording sessions than Bruce Springsteen, the boss on Born to Run. Um, Pretty notable there as well, right? His
Yeah,
perfection.
in August this year. It's going to be Born to Run is going to be celebrating its 50th anniversary,
Isn't
right?
that
50
incredible?
years ago that Bruce moved into Record Plant, New York, and this is a really interesting story because he came in and he'd been working in a studio called 914 Studios as a rinky-dink, beat up old piece of crap, right? His record, this is where he did a couple of records, and he had a new manager. John Landau said, "You deserve the first class studio and you deserve a first class engineer." And he knew exactly the studio was Record Plant, and he knew the engineer was a guy named Roy Cicala. And Roy Cicala, if we talk about Gary and Chris in LA, the guy who ran New York was a guy named Roy Cicala. And Roy was John Lennon's engineer. He produced with John's entire post Beatles catalog was done at Record Plant with Roy behind the board. Bruce wanted Roy, but Roy was burned out. He'd been working with John in the Lost Weekend. He was fried, and he'd heard that about this young kid named Springsteen from his friends up at 914, and he learned a couple of things about him. One, he was a giant pain in the ass. He didn't know when to stop. He couldn't, he kept pushing and pushing and pushing and driving people nuts. And the second thing is he really didn't have any money. He wasn't really, he was not exactly high ticket artist.
Yeah.
But he took the business, but he wasn't going to do the work. He said, you know what, my time is too valuable. My A-list engineers are too busy with real paying artists. I'll give them the kids. So he gave him a bunch of kids, most notably his assistant engineer, Roy's assistant engineer named Jimmy Iovine. And that
Mhm.
record made Iovine famous, and that record certainly made Springsteen famous as well.
And there's another great documentary, The Defiant Ones, that kind of chronicles that time in the studio there pretty well. I really enjoyed that one as well with Jimmy
I think
Iovine
I think it's
and
an example of the young kids who make good, right?
yeah,
There's not a lot of other billionaires who came out of Record Plant. He's a unique story. But there was Todd Rundgren, who was also an assistant, right? There was Tommy Ramone. When they became a Ramone, he was an assistant. There were definitely some success stories, but a lot of
and
really successful producers. That's for sure.
on Jungle Land, I was amazed that it took 16 hours on that just the saxophone on Jungle Land.
Well, that was the end. They had to go on tour, right? And they had to
Yeah.
finish the album. And it was taking place, by the way, it's taking place 50 years ago right now. They were finishing up Jungle Land. They were thinking Thunder Road. They were finishing up the songs. And that solo, they didn't get done until the night before they had to go on the road
Well, and then
with a
how
new
did they
band.
wrap up that recording of Born to Run? They all got together, right? The whole band. What's the story there?
Well, there was a couple things. One, that there was a big studio at that time in New York where there were studios downstairs, and a couple people were mixing songs, a couple people were doing overdubs on the 10th floor, other people were rehearsing. So everybody was doing their part just to get ready to get on tour and to finish the damn album, and they did get it done, and they did get out on tour.
This is also fascinating, and it's all in Buzz Me In, inside the Record Plant Studios. Martin Porter, David Goggin. You got to pick up this book. I think we've got two more artists to talk about here, and I've got about 5 minutes, but I just want to inject here that I think, I talk to so many artists that are up and coming, these artists that want to make it, and they've got passion and they're going after it, but I feel like you've got to go back and understand how the record industry evolved and from what they deal with today to from where it came from. And this is such an excellent book for that. Getting a peek, behind the curtain, understanding the process, and also understanding these legendary names that we're mentioning that came up inside the Record Plant Studios. Again, the book is Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios, Martin Porter and David Goggin. You want to pick up a copy of this for sure. So we're almost to the end here. Aerosmith. They did Get Your Wings and Toys in the Attic. They recorded those two albums there, those two iconic albums. Um, Tell me about that experience.
Well, I'll start. Um, Jack Douglas got a chance to produce by Bob Ezrin, who had great success with Alice Cooper and some other acts, and who we talked to about this. But there was this new group from Boston, Aerosmith, and I don't think Ezrin really wanted to go up to Boston. He sends up Jack, who's kind of a street guy too, and he meets with them. And I interviewed Jack and Joe Perry, and Joe Perry summed it up. Jack read them the riot act. He pulled something shitty in the studio, yelled at them, put them in their place. Uh, I- you know, uh, uh, Joe described it, the process of making that record, that Jack really pulled our nuts out of the fire, and they were able to make a record with these bad boys from Boston. And I think the story about Walk This Way, I'll turn that over to Marty because that involves Young Frankenstein. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I
I
think,
had never heard this story before, but I'd always loved that
but
song.
I think before we get to the story, you got to remember a couple of things. One, I talked about the space, the environment having an influence on the music. Well, Record Plant New York was in a seedy neighborhood. It was West Times Square. It was junkies, hookers, heroin, everything was, it was a bad period back there in the mid 70s on the west side of Manhattan. And it all came out in the music. They were a seedy band. They were a funky band. They sort of Steve Tyler absorbed that neighborhood and it came out in his lyrics and it came out in Joe Perry's licks. And no song really epitomizes that neighborhood more than Walk This Way because they were trying to get a hit on Toys in the Attic. They needed a single. And Joe Perry had this riff, but they just couldn't get the lyrics down. So they said, let's take a break. The band went out into Times Square, starts walking around. And what else do they have in Times Square? They got first run movie theaters. What is one of those movies? Mel Brooks' Young Frankenstein. So they go into the movie, middle of, then they go in there and they watch. And there's one scene where Marty Feldman, the hunchback, does the whole shtick with Walk This Way. And he walks like a hunchback and everybody follows him doing the hunchback shuffle. Well, that cracked the band up. Right. And they did it. It made them so fun. It was so funny that they did the Walk This Way all the way back to the studio and back up to the 10th floor where they were recording. And Steve Tyler said, I got it. I got it. Leave me alone. He went out into the stairwell. Half hour later, he walked in with the lyrics to Walk This Way, which is this proto punk rap song that David Johansen said to Joe Perry, that's got to be the dirtiest song I ever heard.
That's such a great story. I love it that he wrote the lyrics on the wall in the stairwell too. That's
Yep.
that just because been one of my favorite songs since teenage years, and then that really kind of brings. I love when you hear the story behind the story. So we're gonna finish here with the late Ozzy Osbourne. We're
Yeah,
gonna listen.
may he rest in peace.
Yes.
You know,
John Michael Ozzy Osbourne, born December 3rd, 1948, and we just lost him here on July 22nd. Yes, may he rest in peace.
well, if you go back to the early 70s, the band was ready to do its first, Black Sabbath was ready to do its first album in the United States and produce their first album themselves, right? They were living in Bel Air. They were doing massive amounts of cocaine. And we need to sort of put it in perspective, but coke was one of the major consumables in the studio music business in those days. You consumed a lot of recording tape. An artist consumed a lot of cocaine in those days. It was before anybody knew that the drug would drive you nuts, right? And the band was Record Plant, although it accommodated its artists. With that being a prized consumable, they even put embedded mirrors on the consoles and it was up to the assistants to make sure there was a fresh razor blade, nice and sharp for cutting tape and also cutting lines, right, on the console. Well, nobody took more advantage of those than Ozzy and Black Sabbath. And it's the legend has it that not only was there a massive amount of cocaine used, but they actually spent $65,000 on studio time for that album, but $75,000 was spent on the cocaine, and the cocaine was shuffled back and forth between in instrument cases and road cases back and forth between their Bel Air mansion where they were staying and record plant where that song was a song Snowblind. And not surprising, that song Snowblind was probably the biggest hit out of volume 4, which was recorded there.
And how did the album do, despite all of that? And that also, that time and the drug use started to splinter the band, right? They didn't break up yet, but it started that, um, that process of these guys not getting along. But how did the album, despite all of that, all of the turmoil and success, how did it do?
Well, great art, it has its own stories. It was one of their greatest albums, right?
Albums, yeah.
You can dig into the stories, and we talked about Fleetwood Mac and up at doing Rumors, another band that was doing major. It was part of the culture. If you look back at it, from now it looks, shocking. But then it was a private place. It would lock doors, and it was part of the social scene if you were a rock musician.
Well, the Los Angeles location of the record plant closed in July 2024, opened in 1969 in New York City, but officially closed its doors in July 2024. That decision was influenced by a combination of factors, including the music industry's changed and the financial difficulties. The other two original record plant locations, New York and Sausalito, had already closed. Another, I think, point in this timeline of this incredible recording studio, the record plant studios, John Lennon was recording Walking on Thin Ice at the record plant on December 8th, 1980, the day he was shot and killed. Um, this book is great. I just want to say again, if you love music, and everybody does, who doesn't, if you are in the music industry or if you are an artist that's new to the music industry, you've got to read this book. It's really an eye opener. It's fascinating. There's incredible stories. We've barely scratched the surface. The book is called Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios. Martin Porter and David Goggin, they're the authors. And you can find, I want to send you to their Facebook page, the Record Plant Diaries Facebook page. You go to Facebook, Record Plant Diaries. It's managed by Martin and David. And you can also go to recordplantdiaries.com, and there's a lot of good stuff there. But pick up a copy. Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios, published by Thames and Hudson. You can go there, their website, thamesandhudsonusa.com. Where do you guys want people to pick up this book?
Go to your local bookstore, but if you can't find it, just go to Amazon.
Just go to Amazon. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you for the book. I think it's super important as a piece of history. I appreciate both of you for putting it out there. So thank you so much. Okay, communicate, but listen more and evolve, and go pick up a copy of the book. Buzz Me In, Inside the Record Plant Studios. I'll talk to you soon, gents. Thank you.